Good day, everyone. I am Alexini Lahero, and together with Jesserine and Rosemary, we will be discussing topic 6, which is Holmes and Wilson's Gender and Age. Let me start our discussion with a question. Do women and men speak differently? Do children speak differently from adults? The answer to that is almost certainly yes, and that is because both cases are affected by our culture and society. It is said that linguistic forms used by women and men contrast to different degrees. It is also claimed that women are more linguistically polite than men, and that women and men emphasize different speech functions. These claims will be discussed later on. I will be discussing the first part of this chapter, and it will focus more on the evidence that women and men from the same speech community may tend to use different linguistic forms. We now proceed to gender-exclusive speech differences, highly structured by communities. In example 1, Tayana is a young Amazonian Indian woman from the northwest Amazon basin. She lives with her husband and children and a number of other families in a longhouse. The language of her longhouse is Tuyuka, which is the language of all the men in this tribe, and the language she uses to talk to her children. She comes from a different tribe, and her first language is Desano. She uses Desano to her husband, and he replies in Tuyuka. As seen in the example provided, men and women do not speak in the exact same way as each other in some communities. This shows how Amazonian men and women speak in different languages, even when they are communicating with one another. Although there are communities where the language is shared by both men and women. However, particular linguistic features may occur only in the woman's speech or only in the men's speech. These features are usually small differences in pronunciation or word shape. In other languages, word shapes contrast because men and women tend to use different affixes. In the example shown, Yana, a now extinct North American Indian language, and Chiquitano, a South American Indian language. Some of the words used between men are longer than the equivalent words used by women, because the men's forms sometimes add a suffix. In the word deer, ba is in women's form, while in the men's form, it adds a suffix, thus it becomes bana. And there are instances in other languages, just like in traditional standard Japanese. There are also differences between the vocabulary used by men and women, though these are never very extensive. In the example below, in the word father, otosan is used in women's form, while in the men's form, oyaji is used. Gender differences in language are often just one aspect of more pervasive linguistic differences in the society, reflecting social status or power differences. For instance, if a community is very hierarchical, within each level of hierarchy, men are more powerful than women. Then linguistic differences between speech of women and men may be just one dimension of more extensive differences, reflecting the social hierarchy as a whole. An example of that is in Bengali society, wherein a younger person should not address a superior by his or her first name, while a wife, being considered subordinate to her husband, is not permitted to use his name. The fact that there are identifiable differences between women's and men's speech in the communities discussed in this section reflects the clear gender roles. Gender-exclusive speech forms are used only by women and others used only by men, reflect gender-exclusive social roles. We now proceed to gender-preferential speech features, social dialect research. In Western urban communities, where women's and men's social roles overlap, the speech forms they use also overlap. In other words, women and men do not use completely different forms. They use different quantities or frequencies from the same forms. In example 4, Keith was a 7-year-old Canadian from Vancouver whose parents were working for 6 months in the city of Leeds in Yorkshire, England. He had been enrolled at the local school, and after his first day, Keith came home very confused. "What's your teacher's name?" asked his father. "She says she's Mrs. Hall," said Keith. "But when the boys call her Miss Hall, she still answers them. And the girls sometimes call her Mrs. Hall, and sometimes Miss Hall." In all the English-speaking cities where speech data has been collected, for example, women use more ing pronunciations and fewer in pronunciations than men in words like swimming and typing. In the example, women tend to use more of the standard forms than men do, while men use more of the vernacular forms than women do. In gender and social class, how does gender interact with social class? Does the speech of women in one social class resemble that of women from different classes? Or does it more closely resemble the speech of the men from their own social class? The answer to that question is quite complicated, and is different for different linguistic features. There are, however, some general patterns which can be identified. The linguistic features which differ in the speech of men and women are usually features which also distinguish the speech of people from different social classes. As shown in example 5, Linda lives in the south of England and her father is a lawyer. When she was 10 years old, she went to stay for a whole school term with her uncle Tom and Auntie Beth in Wigan, a Lancashire town. She was made to feel very welcome in both her auntie's house and the local school. When she went home, she tried to describe to her teacher what she had noticed about the way her uncle and auntie talked. She explains that her Uncle Tom is a plumber, and he talks just like the other men on the building site where he works. A bit broad. He says house and home. When she's at home, her Auntie Beth talks a bit like Uncle Tom, but she works in a shop, and when she's talking to customers, she talks more like Mrs. Button. She says house and home and talks real nice, just like a lady. In every social class, men use more vernacular forms than women, while women's speech is closer to that of the men in the same group than to that of women in other groups. Therefore, class membership seems to be more important than gender identity. Across all social groups, women generally use more standard forms than men, who uses more vernacular forms of words. It is said that men prefer vernacular forms because they carry connotations of masculinity and toughness, whereas women must speak carefully and politely, and therefore use more standard forms in language. Society also tends to expect better behavior from women than from men. Thus, they serve as a role model for children's speech. So that is all for my discussion on gender. We will now proceed to the explanations of women's linguistic behavior, which will be discussed by my groupmate, Ms. Jesseline Dado.
All around me are familiar faces, worn out places, worn out faces, bright and early for their daily races, going nowhere, going nowhere, and their tears are filling up their glasses. No expression, no expression. Mad world, mad world.
Why is it always why women use standard speech forms and not why can't men use standard speech forms? Gender disparity has always been an issue in humanity. Even before, men are considered patriarchs and women are always seen as a subordinate. For today's video, I am going to discuss about women's linguistic behavior. Ladies and gentlemen, I am Jesserine Marie, and today we are bound to learn something. So I have let you watch a short clip or ad that is related to our topic. In that video, we have seen the gender label and how society label women. In linguistic behavior, we will discuss why do women use more standard forms compared to men. So we have at least 4 explanations that I will thoroughly discuss. And these topics or these explanations are social class or social status, women's role in society, women's status as a subordinate group, and the function of speech in expressing gender identity, especially masculinity. So, according to Holmes and Wilson, the first explanation to it is the social status or social class of a woman. According to Holmes and Wilson, some linguists have suggested that women use more standard speech forms than men because they are more status conscious than men. The claim is that women are more aware of the fact that the way they speak signals their social class, background, or social status in the community. This explains that we use standard speech forms because we are more focused on how society will view our social status with the way we speak. Studies also show that women who work in a white-collar job has more tendency to use standard forms or standard language as they represent corporate and formal jobs compared to those who work outdoors. In this, we can grasp that women are expected to have a class when talking, then use vernacular language, because when women on a corporate attire use vernacular language, society will see them as vulgar, squammy, palenquera, or not deserving of her position. Men, however, are praised and even labeled as cool when they use vernacular words. So, while women are concerned with their social status, men are perceived as easy-go-lucky persons. Thus, language may become especially significant as a social resource for constructing a professional identity. So, the second explanation to that is that women's role in society. The fact that women use more standard forms than men in speech communities points to the way society tends to expect better behavior from women than from men. Also, misbehavior from boys is tolerated and girls are more quickly corrected. For example, when we talk about body counts, society praise men, saying that, "Uy, ang lakas naman ng apil mo sa mga babae." But when we talk about women's body count, people will throw hate and call the girl slut, laspag, overused, and a lot more offensive adjective to describe the girl. So what does this tell us? Women use standard forms not just because they want to, but because society tells them to do so. So, as we continue on our discussion, I will let you watch a short clip again about gender roles so you have an idea of what my point is.
Okay, so we have to get you a sword, a shield, blue pants. Oh, and I can give you the mustache I wore last Halloween. Oh, come on. So what if you didn't get the role of the princess? Being a knight is awesome. At least you're not playing a tree. Gender role stereotypes are when a person is expected to act in a certain way based on society's expectations related to their gender. Traditional gender roles go back to a time when there were clear and, at times, unequal rules about how people were expected to act based on their gender. People who were born male were expected to be strong and aggressive, not emotional, and, of course, to love sports. People who were born female were expected to be kind and nurturing, emotional, and domestic, meaning they were all supposed to be able to cook and clean. Gender role stereotypes also affect people's understanding of who is beautiful and who is not. People still go to great lengths to try and conform to these unrealistic ideals they see in popular media. They diet, obsessively exercise, and go through plastic surgery. Additionally, strict stereotypes about gender police people's emotions. Girls are not expected to show anger, and boys aren't supposed to be empathetic, nurturing, or vulnerable. Luckily, as times have changed, so have people's expectations about gender roles. More and more people are free to behave in ways that are true to who they really are, and that is a good thing. Until next time! Don't forget to visit me at amaze.org or go to my YouTube channel to watch more. Bye!
So in that video, both gender roles has been discussed, but we should try to focus more on women since we are discussing about the women's linguistic behavior. Women are designated the role of modeling correct behavior in many communities. Predictably, then, society expects women to speak more correctly and standardly than men, especially when they are serving as models for children's speech. Regardless of the gender oppression that is taking up here, being a role model for children is something that we should be proud of. Why? Because it only shows that some men cannot be a role model themselves. So this reason is kind of ridiculous for me, but I will continue now. Women's status as a subordinate group. So this explains that women as a subordinate group must avoid offending men, and so they must speak carefully and politely. Social status explanation suggests that by using more standard speech forms, women are looking after their own need to be valued by the society. So first of all, why is there a need for us to use standard speech forms when we are only asking for the bare minimum? Value isn't something expensive to give, but because we are women, society expects us to do such efforts because they only see us as merely women. Most men has fragile masculinity problem. I'm sorry for the guys, but I'm not generalizing, but it really shows. And why do women always have to adjust to men's egoistic behavior? And why can't men be smart enough to realize that they are the problem themselves? Sometimes. This explains that women use standard forms to protect their image and to avoid saying offensive words to other people. So, do you realize that why should standard or correct behavior need explaining? Because men's speech which uses fewer standard forms, not women's, according to Holmes and Wilson. So the next one is the vernacular forms express machismo. Men prefer vernacular forms because they carry macho connotations of masculinity and toughness. The speakers on a tape who were identified as most likely to win in a street fight were those who use most vernacular forms. It has been suggested then that these forms have covert prestige by contrast with the overt prestige of the standard forms which are cited as model of correctness. We will discuss covert prestige and overt prestige on the next slide. But men are usually involved in street fights. We seldom hear an incident that a woman has participated in street fights, right? So according to Holmes and Wilson, men prefer vernacular forms because it connotates masculinity and toughness. This explains that men use covert prestige because they think that that's how they should be. And you wouldn't want to use standard form in fights or in trash-talking people because you will look like a fool for them. So, covert prestige is how people should speak in order to be considered member of a particular community, and overt prestige is how people speak in order to gain status in the wider community. The converse of this claim is that standard forms tend to be associated with female values and femininity. Women avoid vernacular forms because they are associated with promiscuous women, sluts, and loose morals. You know, the problem is that when women use vernacular forms, they will be labeled as walang modo, walang class, bobo, and other stuff. But when men use vernacular forms, it is given and accepted that they use it because they are men. How is it that when women use vernacular forms, it connotates lack of education, but when men use these forms, it connotates masculinity and toughness? According to Holmes and Wilson, if a higher frequency of vernacular forms convey connotations of masculinity, then why do all speakers from all social classes use more vernacular forms in less formal contexts? So we are down to my last explanation, and this is how are women categorized. I mean, this is not the last yet pala, sorry. The second to the last. So it was widely considered that This is an example. It was widely considered that Rose had married beneath her. Her parents were both doctors, as she was herself. She had been educated at a private girls' school and had proceeded on the basis of an outstanding exam performance to Oxford University. She was earning a very respectable salary from her practice when she married Bruce. Bruce worked in his father's sports shop, and while it was clear he would eventually inherit the business, at the time of their marriage she seemed no match for Rose intellectually, financially, or socially. Nevertheless, the marriage seemed to work despite these apparent disparities. So it is perfectly possible for a woman to be better educated than the man she marries, or even to have a more prestigious job than him. In such cases, women's use of more standard forms would require no explanation at all. They would simply be using appropriate forms which is accurately reflected their social background. So in this example, we can see the patriarchy again because, I don't know, maybe the father thinks that Bruce is more capable in managing their business as he is a guy and he may manage it well than Rose, who is intellectually and financially and socially lamang kay Bruce. So we are down to the last, and it is the influence of the interviewer and the context. In many social dialect studies, the interviewers are middle class, well-educated academics. When people wish to be cooperative, they tend to accommodate to the speech of the person they are talking to, and women tend to be more cooperative conversationalists than men. This explains that during an interview, women use standard forms to converse with the interviewer, as they also use it to ask these people. Women will try their best to deliver the message in the same language as the interviewer for formality. So that's the end of my discussion. Please stand by because Meryl will be the next to discuss about the age and gender of in linguistic behavior.
Age graded feature subspeech. It was the differences in speech community that is associated with age. Children and adults have differences in speech such as in pitch, pronunciation, vocabulary, grammar, and slang. Let's take a look at the example presented in the screen. Later on, I am going to discuss how does age-graded features underlies the example. I was listening to New Zealand radio when they announced that they were going to be interviewing the Minister of Health after the news. I couldn't think who the minister was, so I listened to the interview and I was very impressed with the policies he outlined, and particularly with his sensitive and sympathetic attitudes to the need for cervical screening for women. How sensible, I thought. What an intelligent man. I waited for the end of the interview to find out who he was, and that was an interview with the Minister of Health, Helen Clark, announced the interviewer. Well, at least that explained the sympathetic attitude to women's health issues. Age-graded features of speech. We all know that by the choice of words we can know who is speaking. Older people have their own choice of vocabulary in the way they speak. The same with children and young people, boys and girls, have their own way of speaking, their pronunciation, and even the pitch of the voice. And so we know that when boys and girls hit puberty, there occurred changes in their pitch of voice. It is very common with young boys. We can notice that their voice becomes lower in the pitch. Their vocal cords generally grows faster and bigger than girls. And men's head and lungs are also larger than women. And as you know, older people are bigger than children. That's so we can classify their voice as the same with the voice of girls from boys. These are the changes that comes with the age as well as in gender. There is an exemption. We cannot always say that only men has lower pitch of voice. As we go back in the example 11, The listener assumed that the speaker on the radio program was man because of the choice of words as well as the pitch of voice. Later on, she finds out that it was really a woman. The explanation of this is present in Margaret's situation, who is actually a former Britain's prime minister. We have heard that she undergone a training to lower the pitch of her voice, and that is something associated with the politicians. Even if they are female, in order to portray themselves as manly, to be more dominant, they have to use some male features of speech in order to be taken seriously. They should have such kind of lower pitch of voice. So we know that masculinity is associated with the politics as well as, and that is the reason that even females try to portray this low pitch of voice, and so as men to have high pitch because of social and cultural factors. We had discussed how gender preference influence vehicular and standard forms of words. When it comes to age, young people tend to use more vernacular terms, and when they reach the age of 20 or above, they use terminologies that is necessary, different from what they used when they were young. It is because it's the need of time. So they try to be accepted by the society. And if they are using very vernacular form of language, obviously they could not be hired on a job, or the kind of acceptability which is there for the standard form. When it comes to formal places, they try to avoid it. And so when they grow old, they do not once again care for the society. They again use their vernacular form of language. There are different features of speech which may vary at different ages, and that could underlies pronunciation and grammar. Like all of this may vary from 10 years old or teenager, and when they grow older, they stop using the kind of language they used previously. So all of these patterns are divided but based on the age groups. Younger people tend to use slang language a lot, like in everyday conversation. They try to make it their habit by do they use swear words or slang language because they think that it's the kind of membership to a certain group of people. So if you're not using kind of language they speak, then you are not considered in the group. Like for instance, in New Zealand, young people use the term cool, sweet, awesome for everything that they appreciated. You will know person's group depending on the term he used. Social dialect research has provided a great deal of information about patterns of pronunciation and grammar for different age groups. The speech of young children in Britain and USA is not clearly differentiated by the gender until they reach puberty. Like the difference are not that much prominent. Where areas in Denmark, there's evidence of differences between boys and girls. Use of vernacular versus standard morphological variant form. From young as 4 years old, they use vernacular and standard very different from the terms they used previously. It was something associated with the social dialect. Each has something to do with the social dialect. So wherever you are speaking the language, it may vary. So for example, if someone is using the language in USA, language on age is not that much over there between the boys and the girls. However, when you look at the language on one group compared to another group, there's going to be difference. When children reach middle age, there is some kind of pressure of the society which forces to change their vernacular forms they are using, even the slang language. So how does it change? It changes of what does the society demands. That is why they change from vernacular to standard form of language. In the old age, you there is no such force that is working against the use of vernacular form. So they try to get back to the vernacular form they used previously. Research studies find out that people at young age who undergone negotiations use standard form of language for the purpose that they belong to that specific group. For example, the French Canadians varies language depending on age. As young, they are monolingual in French, so they try to use French. And so when they grow older, there is the need of using English. They go to school and learn that language. They become bilinguals. We all know that English is the universal language all over the world. So there is the need to learn the language. And then at the age when they grow older, they get retired from workplaces, then they once again become monolingual because social pressures are gone. The need of the language is gone. Age grading and language change. When there is change in linguistic form in any community, you can see that the younger people will be using the terminology more as compared to the older people, like the word charis, which means joke only. So any form which is dying would be used by older people, and the younger people, like for the example, the word murasngod, which means younger sister or brother, the new generation is not using it, but the older does. All of these changes underlies the linguistic change in language that concerned age factor. Thank you so much for listening. I would leave you a video for better understanding the topic that I discussed.
Besides gender, age also can influence language. The higher a person's age, the more words they use, so that's their understanding of language structure. Now we are going to discuss deeper about how age influences language. Age grade features of speech. One of the most obvious speech differences between women and men is in the pitch of their voice. Most people believe this difference develops at puberty. Babies usually use simple language, teens usually use slang and unique language, and adults usually use structured language. Boys' vocal cords generally grow faster and bigger than girls at puberty. Men's head and lungs are also larger than women's, just as older people are bigger than children's. As a result, male voice generally sound lower in pitch and women's, just as adult voice sound deeper in the children's. There are other features of people's speech which vary in different age too. Not only pitch, but vocabularies, pronunciation, and grammar can different age groups. Slang is another area of vocabulary which reflects a person's age. Current slang is the linguistic prerogative of young people and generally sound out in the mouth of an older person. This signals membership of a particular group to young. In New Zealand, young people currently use the terms sweet, choice, awesome, and cool to describe something they approve of. Earlier generation of New Zealanders is softer and warmer. Now we are going to discuss about age and social dialect. Research shows that in Britain and in the US there is not much gender-related difference in the speech of children. In Denmark, however, the difference may be there are at the age of 4. They use fewer vernacular forms. Let's move to the other material, age grading and language change. When a linguistic change is spreading through a community, there will be a regular increase or decrease in the use of linguistic form over time. When a form is on the increase, we talk about innovation. This will show up in the graph as a low use of the form by older people and higher among younger people. When the form is on decrease, we talk about disappearing. The opposite will be true. Younger people will use less of the form and older people more.